welcome to the first season of the Is the Planet Doomed podcast. This is a project produced by the students of a course with the same name in the Department of Geography at Colgate University. By unpacking some of the world's most pressing and complex problems, the episodes in this podcast help answer the question, well, are we doomed? In this episode, Remi discusses a little-known consequence of coral bleaching in Australia.
Descending into the water. The scuba diver is engulfed by a rich blue. She continues her descent until she reaches the bottom. Expectations are high, but almost immediately they're replaced with disappointment and sadness. She is not welcomed by a thriving and colorful ecosystem. Instead, she's welcomed by death. White, lifeless corals extend across the ocean floor. The bareness attracts minimal sea life. She silently drifts across the coral reef. It's eerie, almost like a graveyard. The Great Barrier Reef has not always been like this. Typically, it is an ecosystem brimming with colorful corals and fish. However, its purpose goes beyond just housing an abundance of species. Because of its structure, prosperity, and beauty, it has had substantial economic value. If the reef continues to deteriorate, severe socioeconomic problems are on the horizon, and Australian livelihoods will be disrupted. Before we delve into these repercussions, it's important to understand why the reef is dying. The answer is simple: climate change. By releasing pollutants into our atmosphere, the average global temperature has increased, which has directly increased ocean temperatures. The association between increased ocean temperatures and coral bleaching cannot be ignored.
What we did here at Coral Reef Watch was to provide the satellite data that gives the information on the areas where the high temperatures occurred. So there are charts in there showing where the bleaching was worst and where the temperatures were highest for the longest time. And the correlation between that heat stress and where the bleaching occurred was very high.
That was coral ecologist Mark Egan. His explanation of the temperature and bleaching correlation is driven by a coral's dependence on algae. Algae is found in the coral's tissues and acts as its primary food source. When stressed due to increased ocean temperature, the algae leaves the coral. Without its main food source, the coral loses nutrient intake. What's left behind is a skeleton, bleached and brittle. If a coral reef is lucky enough to dodge bleaching, it doesn't mean it's safe from climate change. As global temperatures increase, cyclones become more severe and frequent. Violent wave activity rips reefs apart. Overall, climate change is a reef's ultimate enemy. The Great Barrier Reef helps generate $6 billion a year for the country and employs over 64,000 Australians. If it continues to face mass coral bleaching and frequent cyclone activity, there will be a huge disruption in its economic success. Now, let's explore how.
Oh, we got one. There he goes. He's not stopping.
Fishing, an important sector for Australia's economy. Unfortunately, as the Great Barrier Reef continues to suffer, it becomes less attractive to the fish dependent on its nutrients and shelter. This forces species to relocate, which is detrimental for the fishing industry. In 2008, when tropical cyclone Hamish and Justin hit the coast of Queensland, it destroyed 66% of the Great Barrier Reef structure. After this event, the abundance of coral reef finfish didn't falter. On the other hand, catching coral trout and red-throat emperors lagged for months. This level of unpredictability is extremely worrisome for fishing communities that focus on specified targets. With time, corals can adapt to weather-induced reef destruction, which it did after these cyclones. Positive feedback loops ultimately return to negative. However, the repercussions of rising ocean temperatures is another story. It doesn't give coral beds any time to readapt. The destruction from bleaching and frequent cyclone activity enhances the unpredictability of fish adaptation even more. Commercial fishing alone brings in about $193 million a year to Australia's economy. That's huge. If the reef stops housing an abundance of fish, fishing communities and industries will suffer, directly impacting the economy. The Great Barrier Reef is obviously a valuable ecosystem. But not only that, it's the longest reef in the world, stretching along the majority of Queensland's coast and totaling 2,300 kilometers. With its length comes great responsibility. Specifically, it acts as an important protective agent to Queensland's coastal communities. Dr. Steve Palumbi, marine biologist from Stanford University, highlights the reef's protective nature.
Waves are very destructive. If those waves aren't breaking on the reef, they'd be breaking right here. And if they're breaking right here, they're breaking on the seawall, they're breaking on the road abutment, they're breaking in front of houses. And so those reefs actually do an enormous service to keep the waves far from shore.
On average, coral reefs reduce wave energy by 97%. As this protective wall begins to deteriorate, wave energy will be able to pass over it, endangering coastal communities with waves, storms, and floods. More than 80% of Queensland's population lives on the coast. Local businesses and homes have multiplied along it due to its beauty and access to natural resources. Unfortunately, these areas are at risk. As the Great Barrier Reef continues to depreciate, relocation may be a future reality for most people in the area. Tourism, another important part to Australia's economy. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. It attracts millions of visitors, and thousands of people are supported by tourist-related jobs. As the reef dies, the tourism industry has become increasingly concerned with diminishing tourist inflow in the long run. Ironically, in the short term, a huge influx of tourism is the main concern.
The Australian government thought the reef's dire state would drive tourists away, but it's done the exact opposite. That's great news for the multi-billion-dollar tourism industry, but it could be bad news for the reef itself. This phenomenon is called last chance tourism, and it happens all the time at vanishing destinations.
This reporter from Newsy is not wrong. From online questionnaires and tourist sites, the ultimate result is that tourists are seeking to travel to the Great Barrier Reef before it's too late. This dramatic spike in inflow sounds great, right? Interesting enough, tourist managers are actually dreading increased visitation. The reporter continues.
There's a vicious cycle at play here. Tourists travel to see a destination before it disappears, but in doing so they contribute to its demise, either directly through on-site pressures or through greenhouse gas emissions.
Escorting tourists by planes, boats, and cars contribute to the global pollutants that increase ocean temperatures. Uneducated divers trouncing around and disrespecting the coral beds also disrupts the reef's health. Even though the tourist industry may be booming now, it's impermanent. Increased and uneducated exposure contributes to the reef's mass destruction and could ultimately put the tourist industry on a permanent hiatus. Now, you may be wondering, is there any hope? Is there still a chance to save the Great Barrier Reef and preserve socioeconomic stability? The answer is yes, but changes must start now. As emphasized earlier, the main culprit to the reef's demise is climate change. The Australian government has recently created an action plan, which has made substantial efforts to increase community engagement. Stakeholders have become the main target. When abusive, fisheries and tourism operators are contributors to coral demise. However, they also depend on the health of the reefs and would be willing to alter their methods to preserve it. Switching to more fuel-efficient outboard motors, utilizing a catch-and-release practice for species more vulnerable to climate change, and educating tourists on how to appropriately interact with the reef are all steps in a positive direction. Unfortunately, these alterations can only help so much. If we want to see dramatic changes to the reef, then dramatic changes need to be made on a global level.
We have now a window of opportunity to change the trajectory of global emissions and global warming. If we insist on business as usual with growth in emissions of greenhouse gases, then the future of coral reefs will be pretty bleak. It's really up to us, and it's up to governments all around the world.
That was Terry Hughes, a coral reef scientist. He's optimistic of the Great Barrier Reef's future, but time is limited and global cooperation is necessary. The Great Barrier Reef isn't the only reef suffering. coral destruction has become a worldwide phenomenon. We still have the capability to save them, but governments around the world need to act now. If not, it'll be too late. For Colgate University, I'm Remi Filippini.